Our co-host of this 11th feature session is Korea NGO Council for Overseas Development Cooperation. Professor In Han-song, Vice President of Student Affairs and the Director of Ban Ki-moon Center for International Cooperation at Yonsei University, will lead a discussion on the CSO's efforts to ensure our common future while leaving no one behind. Professor Song, the floor is all yours.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. As have been introduced, I am Song In-han. Welcome to the session co-hosted by KCOC. It is a great pleasure to meet 4 honorable members of this panel. We will take a look at the direction of the civic society to achieve the SDGs. It's an honor to moderate this session. Things are very different before and after the outbreak of COVID-19. If we were to host this forum before COVID-19, we would have an empty audience on the last session of day 2. But I'm sure that more people will participate online for this session, and this session can be viewed later at the time of the audience's convenience. This year is the 4th GEEF. When we first started, we wanted to make sure that we have an international forum. But we do have feedback from overseas that they want to know more about Korea. And there are more people who actually want to listen to sessions in the Korean language. And so we can see that the influence of Korea around the world has grown in the last 4 years. As you're well aware, in July of 2021, Korea was named an advanced nation. But even before that, according to the standards of IMF and OECD, as well as many international organizations, we have been recognized as an advanced country. But are we leading the way for coexistence? I believe that this is the role of KCOC. This is what KCOC has done thus far and that what they will do into the future. This year's GEEF is themed Remember Our Common Future. In 1987, our Common Future Report was published by the UN. And we are looking back to this report to remind ourselves of when we first adapted the SDGs. This session co-hosted with KCOC, we have titled this session, Remember Our Promise. The civic activities in the areas of SDGs, what kind of history have we created during the last decade or so? We have invited 4 panelists, and if we were to introduce them one by one, it would take the full hour. And so I would like to take this opportunity to just briefly introduce them to you. And during their presentations, I'm sure that we will be able to listen to what they have been doing thus far. We have with us Secretary General of KCOC. Secretary General Cho, as you're well aware, is heading KCOC, which brings together more than 140 civic groups. During the last 40 years, he has been working as a diplomat. And as a Director General, he was the first to introduce public diplomacy. We also have with us President Hwan of World Vision Korea. He has served as the president since 2021, serving the world to save children from hunger and pain. Before that, for 30 years, he has been a scholar in the field of biology. He served as the president of the Asia Pacific AIDS Society and has worked on various medical issues. We have with us Board Chair Joon of Save the Children Korea. He has been serving in this position since 2008, and he also is a professor at Kyunghee University. He has also served as the Korean ambassador to the UN, and he has worked as a multilateral diplomacy expert for the last 30 years. We also have with us President Wonsik of Korea Food for the Hungry International. He has worked for hungry children around the world. What is very interesting is that he has been a CEO in the IT industry for a very long time, showcasing his leadership in the private sector. Before we go into the actual presentations, let me now ask a question, just as a warm-up. I hope I'm not catching anybody off guard. So we have an extensive list of achievements for all 4 of our panelists in the academia, in diplomacy, in IT. So you have this career under your belt, but what are some new things that you have experienced after joining an NGO? Maybe we can go to Secretary General Cho first.
I would like to ask the other panel members to go first because I need time to think about my answers to this question.
부탁드려도 괜찮을까요?
Maybe we can go to President Wonsik. Well, it's an honor for me to be the first to answer this question. As you have mentioned, I have spent 33 years in the IT industry, and I have spent the last 7 years in this NGO. These 2 segments are very different segments. Companies set goals, and everyone moves in that direction. And so these organizations are very speedy. But at NGOs, the goals are about visions and sharing values. And if we're not able to share values and share visions, we cannot move forward. This is something that I have experienced in my current position. So in order to create value, shared vision is more important than anything else at an NGO. And so that could mean that the speed may be a little bit slower than private companies. At first, it was very difficult for me to adjust to this speed, but I fully understand the meaning of this. And I also understand that at times, the direction is more important than speed. Thank you very much. Thank you for your frank answer. Well, then let's go to Board Chair Joon.
Thank you very much. I worked as a diplomat, and compared to my career as a diplomat versus my position right now, I come to think about the rights of children and the rights of people with disabilities. I work with various NGOs that cover these parts of the population. And when I worked at the UN or in other international organizations, I cared for these topics, but I think that there are differences in terms of the approaches. When I was working in the government, at that time, the approach was rather fixed. And the downside of that would be that we would end up following the same practices and the same approaches. But in the NGO sector, there is a high level of enthusiasm and there's innovation in terms of creating new approaches. Thank you.
우리 또 이생명
Let us now go to President Hwan, who has worked in the field of biology and medicine. For the last 30 years, I was a professor at Konkuk University. The academia and NGO are very different in terms of organizations. I thought it would feel very unfamiliar, but it did not, because during the last 20 years, I served as the chairman of the Asia-Pacific HIV/AIDS Society. In particular, we work to serve the children who are dying from HIV/AIDS. And so the work that we do at World Vision actually is quite similar to the work that we have done at the Asia-Pacific Society. And personally, I was also a sponsor child And so working at World Vision that helps children it feels like my fate, and I am very happy to serve in this position. Thank you.
말씀 듣다 보니
Thank you very much. Next. Yes, I took some time to think about it. I worked in the government for more than 30 years and I switched to the private sector, actually the non-governmental organization. And I thought about the differences between the two sectors myself. And my own conclusion is that these two sectors are on one hand these are arteries and the other or NGOs are small vessels. So I think that in order to achieve a certain objective, both the private sector and the public sector need to join hands and join forces. So there needs to be a lot of cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. And then we need to assign roles and responsibilities for each of these sectors so that we can have effective cooperation to achieve national goals. I would say that the government serves as the big arteries that send large amounts of blood, and then these bloods would need to be distributed to the local sites and to the ground by using fine blood vessels. So I would say that the NGOs are similar to what the smaller blood vessels are doing, while the government is serving as large arteries. That's how I can compare between the two. Thank you.
짝스러운 질문.
So we did ask this question without any previous plans, but thank you very much for those frank answers. So let us now invite Secretary General Cho Daeshik of KCOC for his presentation to start the panel. This will be a great opportunity for us to take a look at the role of the civic society to achieve the SDGs.
Thank you very much. I will spend the next 10 minutes discussing the role of civil society in achieving the SDGs. In the process of achieving the SDGs, there is a particular role that civil society can play, and this is the topic of my presentation. I am working at the KCOC, the Korea NGO Council for Overseas Development Cooperation. It is an alliance or council that includes more than 140 non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. And there are more than 4.4 million citizens that are sponsoring and supporting these organizations. And thanks to their support, we're able to carry out various activities. Therefore, civil society organizations represent the voices of the citizens in achieving the SDGs. I prepared 3 slides. I'd like to go over these slides one by one. First of all, when it comes to the SDGs, the role of the civil society organizations or non-profit organizations and non-governmental organizations combined, I believe that there are 2 roles that are played by CSOs. The first role is the role that they play in the formation of the agenda. And the second role is the role that they play in implementing the agenda items. So there are these 2 big roles that are played by the CSOs. So let me go into a little more detail. The first role is the one that is played in the process of formatting or developing agenda. It means that civil society organizations participate in the agenda setting process, and this can be divided into 2 under the umbrella of the SDGs. The SDGs are common goals for the humanity, and in the process of negotiating the SDGs, civil society participated in the agenda setting process. So on the left-hand side, this was quite different from what we had during the MDG agenda setting process. When the international community was working to develop the MDGs, civil society was not invited in the agenda setting process, but for the SDGs, civil society was included. And it reminded me of such expressions as co-authoring. When there were MDG negotiations, they were mainly participated by the UN as well as national governments. So this means that the government authorities and the UN were the main authors of the MDGs. But now, in the process of agenda setting for SDGs, various stakeholders participated and they served as co-authors. I believe that this is a key highlight that we need to remember. Civil society participated as co-authors. And as a result of such participation, there has to be some result. As a result of such participation, we were able to contribute to the result of including at least 2 SDGs in the set of SDGs. Specifically, Sustainable Development Goal number 10 was included as a result of civil society effort, which is about inequalities, and SDG number 16, which is about partnership. These were the 2 SDG targets where civil society played a big part. Now, when it comes to the specific ways in which they were able to make such a contribution, one example is this campaign. In 2015, the SDG negotiations were held. And even before that, starting from 2010, on the international community, there were various initiatives to reflect the voices of civil society. So the civil society network was created, and one of them was called Beyond 2015. So based on this network, NPOs, NGOs, and civil society organizations from many different countries joined forces, and they carried out campaigns to ensure that their needs and their voices will be reflected. And in 2010, at the UN, the negotiation systems were put in place, and in 2012, 2 years from that, the Beyond 2015 Korea was launched, and KCOC was at the center of creating this initiative in Korea, together with various non-governmental and non-profit organizations. Now, let me show you the final slide. As I mentioned before, civil society played a role in the implementation of the agenda. What this slide shows is that in the process of implementing these SDGs, civil society can play a role, and there are 3 types of roles that they can play. First of all, as is colored in yellow, this is about implementing specific projects, and we can call this service delivery. For instance, civil society can implement various projects to eliminate hunger and inequalities. So local economy development projects and other projects can be carried out by civil society to reduce inequality and eliminate hunger. So that's one part. And there are 2 other areas where civil society plays a part. But they are differently color-coded differently. Between 2000 and 2015, we lived through the era of the MDGs, and at that time, civil society was not included in the agenda-setting process. So at that time, in implementing the MDGs, there were civil society activities that these activities were carried out by civil society on their own, regardless of the MDGs. But now, after the MDGs were adopted, civil society began to play a larger role. So this is what I mean by MDG 3. It means that there's 3-fold increase in terms of the role of civil society. for the SDGs compared to what we had during the MDG implementation. Civil society not only implements projects but also advocacy and governance related activities. And we can compare these three areas in this way. The yellow part, project implementation. Project implementation means that civil society organizations and NGOs have been already carrying out various projects. But the other two domains, advocacy and governance, these are new areas for CSOs. Advocacy is about voicing their positions and monitoring government activities. Such advocacy activities are carried out by CSOs against the government. So the yellow domain is more of an internal activities of CSOs, but advocacy is more of an outward activities. And finally, we have this governance area where civil society and government and private sector actors cooperate and form partnerships. And in this process, civil society can play a big part. And that is why I said talk or leading the governance or leading partnership with the other entities. I think I've used up my time, but once again, there are these three areas where civil society plays a role. And so in this way, civil society was able to contribute to SDG implementation. Thank you. Thank you.
10분에
Well, everyone has been allocated 10 minutes, but everyone has indeed too much experience and knowledge to share in just 10 minutes. Thank you very much for sharing that analogy with us. Now we need to become coerce instead of readers. I'm sure that many people have questions, and we will continue with Q&A after all of the presentations. Next, we will be inviting President Hwan of World Vision Korea. Good afternoon. Well, we are all making efforts to achieve SDGs, but there are still many children who are not benefiting from our achievements. Many people, in fact, 84 million people are being forcibly displaced. 274 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. 2/3 of the children who need help are living in fragile and conflict-affected situations. By 2030, we will see that 1/3 of the population will still remain as a fragile state. So even until 2030, 1/3 of the population in the fragile states will remain as children. And so if we take a look at the SDGs, we can see that there are gaps between fragile states and non-fragile states. For the fragile states, the SDG achievements are very slow, but for the non-fragile states, you can see that the achievement is very high. You can see that the areas marked in blue are the conflict zones. So those are the fragile states, and the areas marked in yellow are the conflict-affected countries. 1 out of every 6 children currently live in conflict zones. That is quite unfortunate. What about the children in these fragile contexts? These are the current situation of the children. They are exposed to recruitment and use, killing and maiming, rape or other forms of sexual violence, abductions, attacks on schools and hospitals, and denial of humanitarian access. In Syria, they are living in conflict for 11 years, and children are suffering. In Afghanistan, the girls are exposed to early marriages and they are being denied their right to education. In South Sudan, children are affected by war, hunger, droughts, and floods. And so the children are in very dire situations. And here you can see the Rohingya children. This is the area with the highest concentration of population in the refugee camps. So these are very densely populated refugee camps. In order to find solutions, we need to make sure that all work together. We need to remember that the countries, the governments, the NGOs cannot work alone to find these solutions. We have to work together. World Vision was founded in 1950 to help children suffering from Korean War. And currently, we work in nearly 100 countries, and we are working to find solutions for various issues. We need to achieve the SDGs by 2030, and that is why we have a strategy titled Our Promise. So across World Vision, 60% of the budget has been increased to achieve $600 million. And at World Vision Korea, we are investing $30 million in fragile countries. We are working with children in the most vulnerable areas through our school. And currently, about 4.7 million children are being educated in World Vision centers. And you can see the bracelets, and these bracelets are provided to our sponsors. The strategy at World Vision is the Fragile Context Program approach. When we go into a fragile area, we usually provide medical aid or food, but we need to go beyond that. We need to make sure that we provide what they need in their context. And we need to make sure that we address the root causes so that we can provide a safe environment for the children. That is the approach that we have. For example, in Congo, the area of Binja is where we have this program. Binja is an extremely dangerous place. There has been 11 natural disasters, which was caused by climate change, and there was also issues of kidnapping and armed robbery threatening children's lives. And so we are now here in Binja to help the children there. This is what we're doing in Binja. As we have mentioned before, we need to take a look at what the children need locally. And so we provide what they need, and we also provide adaptation approaches, and we continue to help them until their lives become secure. And up until then, World Vision will stay with them. In order to create these transformational changes to help the children, the communities, and the families, we have 3 suggestions. First, we need to respect the voice from the most vulnerable children and communities living in fragile context. And so we're not trying to provide strategies that we have designed at our headquarters, but we are trying to reflect the voice of the most vulnerable so that we can provide services that accommodate to their needs. We also need to make sure that we strengthen cooperation with the civil society representing them, because they are the ones who are closely listening to the voice of the most vulnerable. And so we need to make sure that we strengthen cooperation with those who are representing the vulnerable children. Second, when we help them, we need to increase the sustainability and flexibility of our resources. For example, in order to provide them with food, we have a food budget. So through our projects, we wish to protect the most vulnerable children. And they should be given our highest priority by putting the last first. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your explanation on World Vision activities, in particular your activities in the most fragile states. It was very inspiring. And as you have mentioned before, we need to strengthen and empower. One of the core values of GEEF is not to provide aid as we see fit, but accommodating to the needs of the local people.
사장
Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Oh Joon from Save the Children. Hello, everyone. What I'd like to discuss in my presentation is climate action. We sometimes call this climate response or climate action. I'd like to talk about the role of civil society in terms of climate action. I've had my personal history with the SDGs. In 2015, the SDGs were adopted, and at that time, I was president of UN KCOC. And as you may know, the SDGs were adopted at the General Assembly. However, in the process of negotiations as the president of KCOC at that time, I had to play a role. When we were adopting the 17 goals, we had to think once again about the need for the 17 goals because there were two major global challenges. One was increasing inequalities and the other was climate. SDG number 10 and 13 were about inequalities and climate. And a lot of people wondered whether these two would need to be separately included as separate SDGs. So there were a lot of discussions, but the conclusion was that SDG 10 and this SDG 13 were included as standalone goals. Under each goal, you can find targets, specific objectives. And there are 5 targets under SDG 13. There are more than 160 targets for the 17 goals, but for goal number 13, there are 5 targets, which means that of the entire SDGs, climate-related targets are already included in many other goals, and that is why we only have 5 targets for SDG number 13. Currently, there are many CO2 emissions, and the largest emitters are China, India, and the US, and Korea is ranked number 7 in terms of CO2 emissions. On that same year of 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted, and there are several key points. In my opinion, I think that limiting the temperature rise to less than 2 degrees Celsius, or even better, 1.5 degrees Celsius, this was a very important agreement. And in order to achieve this goal, countries decided to work on mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation was about reducing the CO2 emissions, and adaptation was about changing our practices to be adapted to the changing climate. After the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, the mechanism was put in place to check back on the progress of the Paris Agreement implementation on a regular basis, because the Paris Agreement was based on the NDCs, which are voluntary targets submitted by the member states. So the international community decided to review the progress every 5 years to present even more ambitious targets as time goes by. So last year, COP26 was held. This is the Convention of the Parties to the Climate Change Agreement, and it was held in Scotland. This was where the member states got together and they sat down and did stock taking on the progress. And COP26 was held last year because of the pandemic. It was postponed by a year. And there, the participants agreed that we would need to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and there were very ambitious agreements that were pursued, but these agreements were not reached. Instead, the parties decided to discuss this further down the road, and they decided to strengthen their climate ambitions. But you can check on the Climate Action Tracker, which is a very useful website, and you can find here that as business usual will not enable us to limit the temperature rise. The optimistic scenario is 1.8 degrees Celsius increase. But if we just go as business usual as it is, then it's going to lead to a 2.7 degrees Celsius increase of global temperature, which will lead to major disasters. And BBC came up with this summary of the COP26 discussions. And here you can see that emission cuts were not sufficient. The newly submitted NDCs, even though you consider all of these, there will be gigatons of CO2 emissions by 2030. Ideally, we would want to emit 26.6 gigatons of CO2 to be able to reach our target. But even if we assume that all countries live up to their pledges, it will still not be sufficient. And the other graph shows the gap in climate finance. By 2023, $100 billion of financial resources had to be mobilized. However, we were not able to achieve this, and the timeline has been postponed. In these circumstances, I believe that civil society can play a role in these areas. First of all, non-political approach. Secondly, inclusive approach. And third, impact on business can be pursued by civil society. What I mean by non-political approach is that there are many governmental pledges for climate action. And in order to implement these pledges, all countries need to reduce emissions together. But some countries argue that they cannot cut emissions because of economic development, and they're asking other countries to cut emissions while they are not willing to do so. Then this will become a political issue. For instance, in Korea, there are voices for coal phasing, and some say that 30,000 people will lose their jobs when we stop using coal. This is a political matter that politicians cannot handle. But just because we need to protect the earth, we cannot just say that 30,000 people can lose their jobs. This is not what the politicians can say. But it's not necessarily the fault of the politicians, but rather it is the public and citizens and their fault for not accepting politicians who are demanding coal phase out for the benefit of the planet. I believe that we need a non-political approach where citizens engage in active discussion debates to come up with measures to address climate problems. And this is where civil society can play a role. And secondly, we need to take an inclusive approach, including children and women and people with disabilities. The vulnerable groups of our society, they may not be able to raise their voices. So we need to be more inclusive in terms of climate action. And finally, we need to think about the impact on business. It's not just about government regulations on industries, but rather civil society can play a part. For instance, we can do a boycott or other kinds of campaigns to put pressure on corporations or companies who are polluting the environment. When you visit the UN website, you can find civil society climate action stories. These are best cases and best practices. And we have actually one story from Korea. And you can go and check out this website to learn more about what other civil society organizations are doing around the world for climate action. And I hope that there will be more such stories coming from Korea. And finally, Save the Children is the first non-environmental NGO accredited by the Green Climate Fund. So we've been working with GCF in various countries around the world. Save the Children Korea also launched the Climate Crisis Response Team in 2020. And we are leading a GCF project with a budget of $10 million in Indonesia. So these are some of the community-based projects where we intend to leave no one behind. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much for your presentation. As you may know very well, sustainability, it's not just sustainability any longer. It has to be understood as habitability. In other words, we need to think about the survival of the humanity, whether we can continue to habitate this planet. And I believe that his presentation gave us a very clear direction. Thank you.
The last presentation will be by President Wonsik of Korea Food for the Hungry International. Thank you very much. Given the ongoing COVID-19 situation, the international community is met with new crisis. We are seeing more frequent disasters caused by climate change. COVID-19 is creating hunger around the world. 2.2 billion children are being excluded from education. Whatever group you may belong to, no one group can find solutions alone. We need coalition and partnership to act together. That is our reality. We have 17 development goals, and these goals cannot be achieved by any single country. It is a common set of goals for all of us. Partnership for goal number 17 is about partnership for the goals, and it emphasizes global partnership. NGOs must work on recognizing the importance of partnerships, and we are making efforts to create partnership around the world. I would like to take this opportunity to share with you the experience of KFHI and to talk about the partnership between NGOs. Leave no one behind. That is the theme for the SDGs. So in the process of achieving SDGs, we need to make sure that we do not leave anyone behind. We need to make sure that everyone works together and shares the achievements together. But on site, we tend to think the beneficiaries are simple beneficiaries rather than partners. Even until very recently, we have seen aid coming from the global north to the global south. Not only the international organizations, but the wealthy nations, we need to make sure that the local communities who are benefiting from such aid to become partners. It is quite ironic, but due to COVID-19, we have seen capacity building in the global south to help themselves. The groups providing development aid are not providing unilateral aid, but rather they are empowering the local communities to achieve the SDGs themselves. That is the role that NGOs should play. NGOs are at the heart of development, and so we need to make sure that NGOs contribute to leaving no one behind. KFHI dreams of a future where all children are free from suffering in all aspects, and that is why we have a full portfolio of activities. We want to make sure that the children, homes, and communities recover and help other communities. First, we need to make sure that we have sustainable development of local communities. And we also need to make sure that all communities, including those who help and those who receive help, become a part of this partnership. We believe that everyone involved are equal partners, and that is why we have a few principles for local partnership. First, we establish the partnerships before our projects. At least 6 months to a year before actual projects, we establish communities by signing MOUs with local communities so that we can build trust before our projects. We also have a communication governance with the partners. We have regular communication with the partners so that we can actually share information and open information. And third, we also have plans for sustainable self-help. When we conduct projects, we always think about how the local communities can be empowered to help themselves. And based on these 3 principles, we make sure that the local communities grow into equal partners. And after the project is completed, we continue with mentoring so that we can support the sustainable development of the local areas. That is the exit strategy of KFHI. In order to effectively achieve these goals, not only do we need partnership locally, but we also need partnership with all stakeholders, including the government and the corporate sector. We play a very important role in channeling the stakeholders towards a single partnership. In order to achieve a common goal, we need to trust the other stakeholders and cooperate for the same goals. Especially for international development, we need to make sure that the central government, the local communities, KCOC, and the private sector need to be joined through a single partnership. Partnership based on trust can contribute to achieving SDGs and also to strengthen the impact of our projects. Kumi of Uganda is an area where the percentage of those in poverty was close to 30%. There was a lack of infrastructure and also energy, so productivity was very low. In order to have sustainable improvements of income in Kumi, we worked with Seoul Energy Corporation, Inha University, KFHI, and the local community. We did not provide simple farming techniques to the local farmers, but rather we empowered them to learn and we conducted capacity building. KFHI provided funds. They also provided professional consulting and monitoring and evaluation. Seoul Energy Corporation supported us with funds and advised us on renewable energy, as well as solar water supply equipment consulting. Inha University provided support for commercialization as well as business competency education. The local community provided permissions for infrastructure and provided advice for local situations. KFHI conducted coordination of partners as well as program design and monitoring. We also played the role as a channel to connecting resources. So all stakeholders throughout the process worked on increasing the income generation capacity of the local farmers. Because we had the same goal and vision, we were able to contribute to the achievement of SDGs. In the area of Uganda, we conducted the Green Light Project. We were able to work with the schools and local health centers to provide infrastructure. We utilized Kia Motors' mobility capabilities so that we can expand mobile clinic centers. In order to provide income generation opportunities, we conducted self-reliance programs. And after we finished the project, we had a local handover ceremony. And we continued to mentor them, to support them to continue these activities on their own. For the same goal, many stakeholders work together to achieve the goals together. So in conclusion, the achievement of SDGs cannot be done by any one organization. We need to remember the importance of partnership in order to achieve our goals together. As we conduct local projects, we have experienced that cooperation through partnership is inevitable. Governments, companies, And the local stakeholders need to leverage their strengths in conducting the partnership. If there are limitations in the partnership, the governments and the companies should become fundraisers, but they should not stop at that. We need to make sure that there's a full circle of partnership. The Kumi project in Uganda and the GLP project are examples of having a single vision of self-reliance by the local community, and that is why we were able to achieve successful results. The success of partnership is about shared vision, and it is also about mutual trust of each other's capabilities. Everyone needs to work together in order to achieve our goals. We dream of a partnership where no one is left behind in order to achieve the SDGs. Thank you very much. Thank you. We have heard 4 presentations, and we could see a very clear set of identity and roles for NGOs. So this is different from the role of governments and international institutions or even individuals. So they are in the middle, channeling partnership on both sides, and that has actually led to successful results. So we have very limited time, and it's very difficult to ask each and every member of the panel a different question. So I give you a common question. So what is one success story that could not have been achieved if you were not an NGO? Are there any successful stories of achieving SDGs because you're an NGO? And on the flip side, are there any achievements that you were not able to get because of the limitations of NGOs?
네.
Let me go first. I believe that we need to finish with a good note. So I like to talk about some of the challenges or the negative aspect of NGO operations. I'm not saying NGOs were wrong, but there are certain limitations as to what NGOs can do. In 2010, Korea joined DAC, OECD DAC, Development Assistance Committee, and at that time, Korea made a promise that by 2015, our ODA size would increase to 0.25% of the GDP. And even if we did so, it would be still below the recommended level of 0.7. So it's only 1/3 of what would be desirable, but at the time, this was the promise made by Korea, 0.25%, and that was during the No Moo-hyun administration. And then President Lee Myung-bak's administration came in, and they decided to change this target because they thought it was too much, and Korea would still need to invest more on economic development. And at the end of the day, Korea was able to meet this pledge. But regardless of lowering the target, we were not able to meet this target. We're still not even 0.25%. It's not even 0.2%. And it's 2022 now. And so Korea was not really able to meet this promise, keep this promise. I think that we would have been able to keep this promise if we worked really, really hard. We tried really, really hard. But at that time, there was always this reasoning that Korea had to invest more for economic development, not so much about ODA. But we always have economic challenges, but still we need to help other countries, and that is where NGOs can play a part. And last year, Korea submitted an even more ambitious NDC. As of 2018, by 2030, we say that we aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% compared to 2018 level. And I'm quite skeptical I'm not sure if Korea can really meet this target, because if we were that serious about this target, we would have to work really hard to reduce carbon emissions now. But there are a lot of concerns about industries and electricity and power supply, and there are many concerns of the Korean people regarding emissions reduction. But still, we have so many politicians who are populists, and they need to listen to the citizens, but then the citizens have their own interests. So I believe that it is not going to be easy to meet this emissions target. So in that sense, NGO's non-political role is really crucial. Yes, he mentioned the limitations of political leadership, and he talked about the underlying challenges that NGOs need to deal with. Thank you.
총장님.
Next, let's go to Secretary General Wonsik. Well, you talked about how you want to start off on a negative note, but let me balance that out with a positive note. Well, if we take a look at the reality, whether it be in Korea or outside of Korea, we are living in a very dire situations. But where do we find the source of hope? I believe that we find that hope in the civic society and NPOs and NGOs. This is where the source of hope is in this era. And so that's what I would like to mention. Well, we have the last 20 years of working towards the SDGs. We have a positive energy for SDGs, and that positive energy peaked in 2015 when the SDGs were adopted around the world. But after the adoption of SDGs, if we take a look at the recent few years, the environment is actually becoming very difficult, and the energy is dying down because many people believe that realistically they need to survive in this era, and many of the countries are working for their own national interests only. And so the SDGs are not receiving a lot of priority. And so the energy in the international society is making it very difficult to achieve the SDGs. So ironically, whether it be governments or companies, they are very realistic in trying to make profits for themselves, for their interest. And so it's very difficult to hang our hopes on the governments and companies. But on the other hand, there are organizations that put the SDGs at the core of their vision and identity. That is the civil society. And so that is why I believe that ironically, now is the time where we need to hang our hopes on the civil society in order to solve inequality. So everyone says we have to solve inequalities, but the higher we raise our voices, the more people become interested in inequalities within the country, but the less people become interested in inequalities between countries. People lose interest, and this is losing priority. And so that is why this is a great dilemma. And the power to overcome this dilemma comes from the civil society. And so let me try to finish on that positive note. Thank you very much. The hope from the civil society.
Next, I'd like to invite Chairman President Cho. MDGs were government-led agenda, but the SDGs were co-led by the government sector and the civil society. And the direction of the SDGs is very appropriate. And on the ground, civil society works with people who are directly affected by the SDGs. So if civil society fails to play this part of a bridge, then SDGs may not be implemented successfully. And what World Vision has been doing is to offer School of Global Citizenship for more than 10 years for elementary, middle, and high school students, as well as university students. And even idol groups and K-pop stars are participating in the civic global education. We teach people what the SDGs are and why we need the SDGs, why we need to implement these SDGs. So this is part of our educational curriculum for global citizenship. We may not succeed in implementing the SDGs if we do not involve or engage the citizens. If this is an agenda led by the government only, then this would not be successful. It requires understanding of the citizens, support and participation of the citizens for this to be successful. Therefore, I believe that the role of civil society is very, very important. And the government understands the importance of civil society, but there's not enough support for CSOs. I believe that global citizenship education and civic education can play a big part in helping people better understand the SDGs. And we have so far provided such education to hundreds of millions of people. So I believe that this kind of effort will have to continue. Thank you. Yes, as you mentioned, NGOs can help educate our younger generation.
장님께
We will now go to President Wonsik. Well, I completely agree with what everyone else has also mentioned. In the end, I think we can boil that down to communication. That is probably the reason why the leaders of NGOs have been invited here today, for communication. And we also need to have balanced growth and communication between sectors 1 through 3 so that we can achieve the 17 SDGs. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we have heard from 4 prominent speakers, and 1 hour is very limited. We cannot encompass the experience and vast knowledge of everyone here today. As you're well aware, UN SDG emphasizes partnership. So it is about creating a common future together. And within this partnership, we took a look at the role of civil society, and we have been reminded of the importance of this role. Thank you very much once again to the 4 gentlemen for your presentations and comments. Thank you also to our audience for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Song and panelists, for sharing your insights into your selfless NGO activities and, paradoxically, the need for NGOs, especially in this age when governments and political organizations are losing impotence in SDGs. Thank you again.